this section I will provide an overview of how I project manage my work on a daily basis, so as to ensure that projects I take on get delivered on time and meet my customers' requirements. I quickly learned when I started out as an analyst that saying yes all the time to projects can quickly snowball into a situation where you have taken on more work than you can actually manage. As much as I wanted to be able to please my team, and felt if I didn't take on the work, I would be letting my team down, and I was more than capable of producing the work, I hadn't factored into consideration the time it would take to deliver on multiple projects, and something had to change. Sitting down with my team manager at the time, he was also frustrated that he was being put in a position to try and deliver on multiple projects without the necessary resources or headcount, and you soon quickly realise that project management becomes a balancing act for everyone up the levels of management. In my early days of development, the typical methodology adopted by many teams was known as the waterfall life cycle, which entails defining a set of requirements with your customer, providing a delivery date of when you believe you should be able to get the project ready, and then embarking on a development process and getting back to the customer only when you have completed the project. One of the biggest shortcomings of the waterfall life cycle is the lack of interaction with your customer during development. And in the majority of cases when it comes to delivering your projects, if your customer has not been involved in the development process throughout, and had the means to make adjustments to requirements, then the final project outcome may not necessarily meet the customer's expectations, and requirements that were set out potentially months ago have subsequently changed due to the nature of the business. In some companies that I worked for, they also required that you went to long lengths to produce very complex requirements documentation, which in some cases would take more time to document than to actually deliver on your application or project. While this may be necessary in some industries that requirements are airtight, in the majority of cases for the projects I was working on, this was not necessary, and was considered by many on the team as a time-wasting exercise. Striking a balance with your customer and your team expectations is vital if you want your project to succeed. So for the last 10 years, my chosen development methodology of choice has been to utilize what is called Agile development. With Agile development, the development lifecycle is broken down into smaller, more manageable units of work. While there are a number of ways to implement Agile development, Scrum has become one of the more popular methods for software development. With a set of roles, assigned responsibilities amongst a team, and meetings set to take place often on a daily basis with the development team, a single iteration of the development lifecycle in Agile is often referred to as a sprint, and typically lasts anywhere between 1 week to 1 month. A Scrum Master, similar to a project manager, will oversee development efforts, and will work with their team to identify for any given sprint period how many items of development are to be delivered within a sprint. At the end of each sprint, the team will come together with their Scrum Master, and in some cases a member of the business, to review development efforts for the given sprint. For any components that were not successfully completed, feedback will be taken to identify what was the holdup for development, and that piece of development can be placed back into the backlog of requirements for later consideration. The sprint will then be signed off by the Scrum Master and a member of the business and marked as complete. Completed pieces of work will entail not just development efforts, but also that testing has been carried out, and the piece of work is fit for use in production. This process is also sometimes referred to as shrink wrapping, as completed sprints of work do not require any further interaction from the development team. If a project is ever called into question by the business or a business owner, then a Scrum Master will be able to provide details of what percentage of development is fully complete and what work is still outstanding, sometimes demonstrated in what is known as a burn-down chart. In the event that a project needs to be shelved, that is, to make room for another piece of work or to be cancelled outright, then business owners can work with the Scrum Master to come up with a realistic forecast for development and identify which projects are closer to completion and are worth continuing investment in, where in the past using more traditional methodologies such as the waterfall lifecycle, it was very difficult to understand where a project was in terms of development and what was ready to go into production. This was largely due to the fact that testing would be left to the very end of development and more focus was given to development rather than ensuring that requirements still met the business's needs and that project deliverables were coming out of development ready for production. With agile development and running sprints, teams will typically utilize what are called Kanban boards to show their progress of work. A Kanban board utilizes a series of vertical swim lanes and can often be seen around offices in the form of post-it notes stuck to whiteboards, where requirements will be placed in the first lane, often referred to as the backlog, and subsequent lanes moving from left to right will follow the development process, with the rightmost lane being the completion and sign-off lane, and lanes in between will depend on the number of stages of development your team has adopted. On any given post-it note will typically have the requirement name, a given priority, and the initials of the developer taking on the task. A Scrum Master can see at a glance from the Kanban board just how much work has been taken on by each member of their team and can set constraints on development, such as any one developer may not take on more than 3 items of work during a given sprint. And for a developer to take on any more work, they must have their work fully signed off by the business before accepting any further work, thus recognizing just how much work each member of the development team is carrying out and ensuring that a team or individual team member is not taking on more work than they can actually handle. When reviewing Kanban boards, a Scrum Master will typically start with the rightmost lane of items in development. That is, the Scrum Master is trying to identify what items are closer to completion before considering any further items to be brought into a sprint. Hopefully this illustrates that while it is important to be seen as a team player, it is not always in your best interest to say yes to every project, and it is as important for a project manager or Scrum Master to recognize just how much work each member of their team is carrying out. If you find yourself being put in a situation where a member of the business just so happens to pass by your desk and asks you, "Can you quickly take on a piece of work for me?" be sure to refer them to your Kanban board to show them just how much work you are currently carrying out and to redirect them to your project or Scrum Master. For these types of scenarios, I would typically request with my colleague to submit the request to the project queue and inform them that requests are reviewed once a week, typically at the beginning of a week, to identify what new work the team can take on. Also to point out to your colleague that even though they are submitting a request, this does not mean that the request will be carried out straight away, and every project request will be prioritized accordingly. Only when a project is moved from the backlog into the first stage of development, typically requirements gathering, then a member of the development team will be able to give an approximate estimate of when the work will be completed. If your colleague is still adamant that the piece of work needs to be done as soon as possible, then you should request with your colleague that they mark the request for escalation, providing they have sufficient sign-off from a director or senior manager detailing why the work needs to be carried out immediately. When an escalation is taken on board, the project manager or Scrum Master will then need to inform all other subsequent teams that their work will be put on hold until the escalation can be completed. If your business is new to the process of Agile development, this can take some time for your teams to adjust to the new process. My suggestion here would be to hold some Agile development training with your colleagues who will be submitting requests to ensure that they are comfortable with the process and don't set unrealistic expectations. While a project may sit in a backlog for a number of weeks or even months, it is also up to the business owner to review with the project or Scrum Master when the work is likely to be carried out. If a project keeps being pushed out by a Scrum Master, then it may be the case that the development team needs to be expanded so as they can take on more work by having a greater headcount, or that the project may be scrapped entirely where the Scrum Master has reviewed with the overall business to identify what projects are in line with the business roadmap for the year. And any projects that don't meet the overall business roadmap will not be taken into consideration and subsequently removed from the development backlog. To summarize, everyone from the developer right up to the company president plays a part with project management. And while the overall company president may not be concerned with the nuts and bolts of a project, they will be concerned with the overall direction for a company. And if the company also has shareholders, they also want to be seen to be taking on the right amount of work and not to be setting unrealistic expectations for the company. Also, as a developer or analyst, with the more projects you complete over time, you will learn to balance your workload and not to set unrealistic expectations for yourself. So don't be afraid to push back on your colleagues or project or scrum master when required, as you are likely doing everyone a favour by ensuring that your project deliverables are completed on time and meet your customers' requirements. In the next section, I will demonstrate one of the project management tools I have been using for the last number of years, called Trello. And while Trello does not fully support all aspects of Agile development, it does provide a very lightweight Kanban board, which I find for personal and small project development is more than adequate. That's all for this section on project management.